In the archives of Beaufort County, South Carolina, there exists a small collection of documents that historians rarely reference directly, not because they are lost, but because what they imply creates more questions than answers. Among plantation ledgers, medical notes, and private correspondence from the early 1850s is a quiet inconsistency, one that does not announce itself as scandal or horror, but as something far more unsettling, a contradiction, a pregnancy that should not have occurred, a doctor who tried to destroy his own words, and a woman whose body became evidence of something the system could not explain, only suppress. This is Reds of times before. His training offered no room for interpretation. Sarah was approximately 6 months pregnant. Hadley's journal entry from that day is unlike anything else he ever wrote. The handwriting tightens, the phrasing becomes fractured. He does not dramatize the moment, but the panic is evident in what he chooses to record. He writes that he has confirmed a biological impossibility. He questions whether his own mind is failing. He does not speculate about miracles or divine intervention. Instead, he expresses dread because a miracle would imply meaning, and this implied chaos. Hadley understood that if his earlier surgery was documented correctly, and he knew it was, then this pregnancy represented a contradiction that could not exist without exposing something far more dangerous than medical error. It suggested hidden violence, suppressed truth, or an institutional lie so deeply embedded that even trained professionals were expected to ignore it. Sarah, at 24 years old, had been born on the Whitmore Plantation in 1829, recorded in ledgers as healthy stock, suitable for rice cultivation. She had worked tidal fields since childhood, wading through mosquito-infested water, her labor fueling the wealth of men who never entered those fields themselves. By 1851, she was considered valuable property, productive and resilient. That value is likely what saved her life during the hemorrhage that led to surgery. Lesser property might have been left to die. Instead, Hadley was summoned not out of compassion, but preservation of investment. What happened during that period, what caused the internal damage Hadley documented, is never stated outright. But the language he uses, violent trauma, extensive tearing, catastrophic injury, leaves little room for benign interpretation. By 1853, when Sarah's pregnancy became undeniable, the Whitmore Plantation faced a threat not just to its authority, but to its internal logic. Slavery depended on control, categorization, and predictability. Bodies were meant to be understood, measured, and exploited. A body that defied explanation destabilized the entire structure. Hadley knew this. His journal does not ask what should be done for Sarah. It reflects instead on what the existence of this pregnancy could mean if acknowledged. That is why, within months, his private notes ceased to mention her at all. That is why later correspondence reveals restricted access, controlled movement, and unusual medical oversight. The system did not investigate the impossibility. It moved to contain it. And this is where the story truly begins, not with a miracle, but with the moment when truth became a liability and silence became policy. Followed that initial confirmation was not immediate outrage or inquiry, but something far more calculated and far more revealing hesitation, the kind of hesitation that occurs when truth threatens stability. Dr. Hadley did not rush to document his findings publicly, nor did he seek counsel from fellow physicians, even though medical anomalies were often shared privately among educated men of the period. Instead, he returned to his journals repeatedly, rereading his own earlier notes from 1851, scrutinizing his handwriting, his terminology, his conclusions, as if certainty itself could somehow be undone through repetition. His records show him re-examining Sarah multiple times over the following weeks, each examination confirming what he already knew and feared. The pregnancy progressed exactly as a normal gestation would, following patterns so familiar to him that their familiarity became the source of his unease. There were no irregularities, no signs of abnormal development, no evidence that could be dismissed as swelling, tumors, or fluid retention. The child was alive, moving, growing. This was not a case of misdiagnosis layered upon misdiagnosis. It was consistency in defiance of logic. Hadley's professional identity was built on the assumption that the human body, though complex, obeyed rules. Those rules were now broken, and the breaking did not announce itself with spectacle, but with quiet persistence. Each passing day that Sarah remained pregnant deepened the contradiction. Hadley's silence during this period is itself a form of testimony. In a medical culture that prized documentation, his restraint suggests fear, not of being wrong, but of being right. Because if his earlier surgery had indeed rendered Sarah incapable of conceiving, and if she was now undeniably pregnant, then the implications extended beyond medicine into realms the doctor understood all too well. They touched on violence, power, and the unspoken realities of plantation life that polite society depended on doctors not questioning too closely. The Whitmore plantation, like many others in the Low Country, functioned on an unyielding hierarchy. Charles Whitmore was known for personal involvement in discipline and oversight, a man who believed control required proximity. Plantation correspondence and account books portray him as meticulous, profit-driven, and deeply invested in maintaining order. Disorder, especially of the kind that could invite scrutiny, was unacceptable. When Hadley finally communicated his findings to Whitmore, the exchange was not preserved in full, but its aftermath is visible in the records that remain. Sarah's work assignments changed abruptly. She was removed from the rice fields and reassigned to tasks that kept her out of sight. Her movements became restricted. Overseer logs note her presence less frequently, a subtle but telling omission. This was not an act of protection. It was an act of concealment. Pregnancies among enslaved women were common and often encouraged, as they increased a planter's wealth. But this pregnancy was different. It carried with it the risk of questions that could not be answered without exposing events the plantation could not afford to acknowledge. Hadley's role during this period became increasingly conflicted. He continued to monitor Sarah's condition, but his notes grow sparse, almost evasive. He records measurements without commentary, symptoms without interpretation. It is as if he is deliberately stripping his observations of narrative, reducing them to data points that say everything and nothing at once. In one later entry, he notes his own sleeplessness, his inability to reconcile observation with theory. He writes of anatomy texts consulted late into the night, of case histories reviewed and discarded. There is no mention of divine explanation, no turn toward superstition. Instead, there is frustration, because science, which had always provided him with answers, now offered none. The silence around Sarah's condition extended beyond the plantation. No midwife was summoned. No neighboring physicians were consulted. This isolation was intentional. The fewer witnesses, the fewer questions. The system understood that explanation was less important than containment. Hadley, for all his training and status, was not immune to the pressures of that system. His livelihood depended on plantation patronage. His social standing was intertwined with men like Whitmore. To push too hard, to insist on investigation, would have been to risk professional exile at best. At worst, it would have invited scrutiny into practices that everyone benefited from not naming. And so, the pregnancy progressed in a kind of suspended reality, acknowledged by those who could not deny it, and ignored by everyone else. Sarah herself remains almost entirely absent from this part of the record, which is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Her voice does not appear. Her reactions, her fears, her understanding of what was happening to her body are undocumented. She exists only as an object of observation, a site of contradiction. This absence is not accidental. Enslaved people were rarely allowed narrative presence, especially when their experiences threatened the morale scaffolding of the society that exploited them. Whatever Sarah knew about her body, about what had been done to her, about how this pregnancy came to be, was not recorded, because recording it would have required acknowledging her as a witness rather than a specimen. As the months passed, the risk increased. A birth would produce undeniable evidence. A child would exist who could not be explained away by silence alone. Hadley's later journal fragments suggest that this inevitability weighed heavily on him. He begins to write about outcomes without specifying what those outcomes might be. He references necessary discretion and limits of professional responsibility, phrases that signal withdrawal rather than engagement. It is during this period, historians believe, that Hadley began considering the destruction of his own records. The idea that a physician would attempt to erase documentation runs counter to everything the profession claimed to value, and yet it makes perfect sense in a world where truth could destabilize power. The pregnancy was no longer just a medical anomaly, it had become a threat, one that implicated not only a plantation owner, but an entire system built on the assumption that enslaved bodies were fully knowable, fully controllable, and fully owned. Sarah's condition suggested otherwise. It suggested that beneath the ledgers and laws there were realities that refused to conform, even when violence and surgery were applied to enforce compliance. By the time Sarah entered the final months of her pregnancy, the plantation had already moved into a mode of quiet crisis management. No preparations for a recorded birth appear in the ledgers, no allocation of resources for an infant is noted. This absence speaks louder than any surviving document. It suggests foreknowledge that whatever resulted from this pregnancy would not be allowed to enter the official record, and it sets the stage for what comes next, not an explanation, but a disappearance. As the pregnancy advanced into its final trimester, the atmosphere surrounding Sarah shifted from guarded concern to something far more deliberate and controlled, a tightening of circumstance that suggested decisions had already been made behind closed doors. Dr. Hadley's visits became less frequent, but more tense, his examinations shorter, his notes increasingly stripped of descriptive language. Where he once detailed measurements and symptoms with careful precision, he now recorded only confirmations, alive, progressing, unchanged entries that read less like medical observations and more like reluctant acknowledgments. The Whitmore plantation itself seemed to reorganize around the problem her body represented. Overseer logs show alterations in routine, unexplained absences, and reassigned labor schedules that placed Sarah consistently away from communal spaces. She was no longer visible in the fields, no longer counted among the workers whose presence was tracked daily. Instead, she existed in a liminal state, neither fully removed nor openly acknowledged. This was not negligence. It was orchestration. The plantation understood that visibility created witnesses, and witnesses created risk. In the rigid logic of slavery, risk was to be neutralized, not debated. The closer Sarah came to term, the more urgent the need for resolution became. A birth would force a reckoning. A living child would demand classification, ownership, explanation. It would require a name, a record, a place within the plantation's economy. And none of those things could be provided without exposing the contradiction at the heart of its existence. Dr. Hadley's private writings from this period, those fragments that survived his later attempt to destroy them, suggest a man retreating inward. He writes not of Sarah but of limits, of the boundaries of medical responsibility, of the dangers of overinterpretation. These are not the reflections of a scientist seeking truth, but of one seeking insula. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else involved, that the problem was no longer medical, it was institutional. His knowledge placed him in an impossible position. To speak would implicate powerful men and destabilize his own standing. To remain silent would make him complicit in whatever outcome followed. The absence of midwives, the lack of preparation for delivery, and the complete omission of supplies, typically allocated for childbirth, all point to a conclusion that was never written down but can be inferred. The plantation did not intend for this birth to become a documented event. Whether that meant removal, concealment, or something more final is not stated explicitly, but the silence surrounding the moment when Sarah would have gone into labor is absolute. There is no entry noting the onset of labor pains, no record of a delivery, no mention of complications or outcomes. It is as if time itself skips over the moment that mattered most. This gap is not accidental. In historical records, absence often signals intervention. When an event carries too much explanatory weight, erasure becomes the preferred method of control. The plantation's ledgers, meticulous in their accounting of labor and profit, offer no explanation for Sarah's continued absence after this period. She does not reappear among the workers, she is not listed as deceased, she is not recorded as sold or transferred, she simply vanishes. This kind of disappearance was rare precisely because enslaved people were valuable commodities. Death was documented because it represented loss. Sale was recorded because it represented profit. Silence, therefore, suggests neither. It suggests something that could not be categorized without risk. Oral histories from the region, collected generations later, contain faint echoes of a woman who was kept apart and then sent away, though no destination is ever named. Such phrases are common in communities shaped by trauma. They signal events too painful or dangerous to describe directly. What becomes increasingly clear is that whatever happened to Sarah, and whatever resulted from her pregnancy, it was handled outside the formal mechanisms of record-keeping that govern plantation life. This alone marks it as extraordinary. Even acts of extreme violence were typically documented when they served administrative or financial purposes. That this was not suggests that documentation itself had become a liability. Dr. Hadley's role in the aftermath is equally telling. Shortly after the estimated time of Sarah's delivery, his journal entries grow erratic and then abruptly restrained. He begins referencing previous matters obliquely, without detail. His handwriting changes. In later years, he would attempt to burn these volumes, an act that historians view as deeply anomalous. Physicians guarded their journals carefully. They were professional assets, records of experience and authority. To destroy them was to destroy one's own legacy. That Hadley chose to do so indicates fear not of error but of implication. Whatever he witnessed or understood in the wake of Sarah's pregnancy haunted him sufficiently to risk his reputation in order to erase it. Yet erasure was incomplete. Charred fragments survived, enough to confirm that something had occurred that he believed should not exist. Meanwhile, the Whitmore plantation continued operating without disruption. Rice was planted and harvested. Profits flowed. Charles Whitmore's reputation remained intact. There is no evidence of scandal, no inquiry, no external scrutiny. The system absorbed the anomaly and moved on, which may be the most disturbing aspect of all. It demonstrates how effectively power can neutralize contradiction without ever confronting it. The pregnancy that should not have been possible did not dismantle the institution that produced it. It was simply removed from view. And in that removal, a deeper truth emerges. The mystery is not how Sarah Baker, me pregnant after surgical sterilization, but how an entire structure could collaborate, actively or passively, in ensuring that the question was never pursued. The disappearance of both woman and child marks the moment when the story shifts from medical anomaly to historical silence. What follows is not explanation, but aftermath, the lingering effects of a truth that was too disruptive to be allowed a place in the record. In the years immediately following Sarah's disappearance, the Whitmore plantation settled back into its outward routines with unsettling ease, as though the events surrounding her pregnancy had been a temporary disruption rather than a fundamental rupture. Rice cultivation resumed its seasonal rhythm, overseer reports returned to their usual cadence of productivity and punishment, and the ledgers once again reflected the cold arithmetic of profit and loss. Yet beneath this veneer of continuity, subtle distortions began to appear, small, easily overlooked irregularities that only become significant when viewed together. Labor counts fluctuated without explanation. Medical expenses rose briefly and then vanished. Certain names ceased to appear where they should have, replaced by blank space rather than formal notation. This was not carelessness. It was a deliberate recalibration of record-keeping, an adjustment designed to absorb an anomaly without leaving a trace. Charles Whitmore's correspondence from this period reveals a man increasingly preoccupied with control, not only of labor but of narrative. Letters to business associates emphasize stability, order, and discretion. He writes of avoiding unnecessary attention, of maintaining harmony with neighboring planters, of ensuring that nothing on his property invites scrutiny from outsiders. There is no mention of Sarah, no reference to the events of 1853, and yet the tone suggests a heightened awareness of vulnerability. Power, when threatened, does not announce its fear openly, it tightens its grip quietly. Dr. Hadley, meanwhile, underwent a more visible transformation. His practice continued, but his professional boundaries narrowed. He avoided complex obstetric cases and declined to consult on matters involving severe trauma to enslaved women. Colleagues later noted his increasing reserve, his reluctance to discuss past cases, his tendency to redirect conversations that drifted toward moral or philosophical questions about medicine. This withdrawal was not the result of age or fatigue alone. It was the behavior of a man who had encountered something he could not reconcile with the worldview that had sustained him. His later journals, those that escaped the fire, are notable for what they omit. Where earlier volumes were dense with observation and reflection, these are sparse, cautious, almost sterile. It is as if he were attempting to strip his writing of anything that could implicate him in knowledge he wished he did not possess. The attempted destruction of his earlier records becomes, in this context, not an act of madness, but of self-preservation. To leave them intact would have been to preserve evidence of a contradiction that had no safe resolution. Beyond the plantation and the doctor's office, the broader Beaufort community exhibited a collective indifference that was itself a form of complicity. In a small society where news traveled quickly and reputations were carefully managed, it is implausible that nothing was known. More likely, knowledge existed in fragments, glimpsed, suspected, discussed briefly and then suppressed. Such communities functioned on unspoken agreements about what could be acknowledged and what could not. Slavery required this kind of selective blindness to operate smoothly. The everyday violence that sustained it was normalized, but any disruption that threatened to expose its internal contradictions was treated as dangerous. Sarah's pregnancy did exactly that. It suggested that enslaved bodies were not merely passive sites of L.A., bore and reproduction, but contested spaces where power, violence, and biology collided in unpredictable ways. Acknowledging this would have required confronting the reality that control was never as complete as it claimed to be, and so the community chose silence. Over time, that silence hardened into absence. Sarah's name faded from memory, surviving only in scattered references and oral fragments. The child she carried, if it lived, left no trace that can be definitively identified. This erasure was not accidental. It was the final stage of containment. When explanation is impossible, disappearance becomes the solution. Yet the consequences of this erasure did not vanish with the records. They lingered in altered behaviors, in the doctor's retreat, in the plantation's heightened secrecy. They lingered most of all in the unresolved tension between what was documented and what was denied. Historians examining the Whitmore plantation generations later would note these inconsistencies without fully understanding their origin. The gaps were too clean, the omissions too precise to be random, but without explicit testimony they remained puzzles rather than accusations. This is the insidious power of institutional silence. It transforms acts that should provoke outrage into mysteries that invite speculation instead of judgment. The system that produced Sarah's impossible pregnancy survived not because it explained the event, but because it removed the conditions under which explanation could occur. In doing so, it demonstrated a truth far more disturbing than any single anomaly, that structures built on domination can absorb even their own contradictions, provided those contradictions are hidden quickly enough. Sarah's story, therefore, does not end with her disappearance. It continues in the quiet recalibration of power that followed, in the way records were kept and unkept, in the lives shaped by knowledge that could not be spoken. The mystery is not only what happened to her, but how easily the world she inhabited adjusted to ensure that the question would never be asked again. As the years passed, and the immediate shock of Sarah's disappearance receded into the background of plantation life, the consequences of what had occurred did not dissolve so much as they diffused, spreading quietly through the systems and relationships that had absorbed the event without acknowledging it. The Whitmore plantation continued to prosper, but its operations bore subtle marks of recalibration that suggested an unspoken lesson had been learned. Control, already strict, became more procedural. Interactions that might once have relied on informal authority were increasingly mediated through written rules and rigid hierarchies. Overseers recorded less detail about individual bodies and more about aggregate productivity, as if specificity itself had become dangerous. This shift mirrors a broader pattern seen across similar plantations in the Lowcountry during the mid-1850s, where record-keeping became simultaneously more comprehensive and more evasive. More numbers, fewer narratives. It is within this environment that the absence of Sarah's story became normalized. New laborers arrived, others were sold away, children were born and recorded according to the usual arithmetic of ownership. And yet, for those who had been present during the months of concealment, the memory lingered as a kind of institutional anxiety. Oral histories collected generations later describe an atmosphere in which certain questions were discouraged, certain topics redirected with practiced ease. Older enslaved workers warned younger ones not to speculate too openly about disappearances, not because they lacked curiosity, but because they understood the cost of drawing attention to contradictions the system refused to resolve. This culture of restraint did not require constant enforcement. It was learned through observation, through the quiet disappearance of those who disrupted. The expected order. Dr. Hadley's withdrawal from obstetric practice involving enslaved women had ripple effects beyond his own career. Other physicians in the region began to adopt similar caution, limiting the scope of what they documented and how explicitly they described trauma. Medical journals from Beaufort and surrounding districts in the latter half of the decade show a marked decline in detailed case studies involving enslaved patients, replaced by generalized descriptions that avoided specificity. This was not an accident of time or fashion, it was a defensive adaptation. The profession understood, even if it never articulated, that too much precision could expose realities that polite society depended on remaining ambiguous. Medicine, like law and religion, adjusted itself to the demands of the institution it served. The absence of discussion around Sarah's case did not mean it was forgotten, it meant it was absorbed as a cautionary example of what happened when documentation crossed an invisible boundary. Within the Whitmore household itself, changes were also evident. Correspondence from Charles Whitmore in the late 1850s reveals an increased emphasis on legacy and reputation. He invested in local institutions, contributed to civic projects, and cultivated an image of stability and respectability. These acts can be read as ordinary markers of a successful planter's life, but when placed alongside the earlier events, they take on an additional dimension. Reputation became a form of insulation. By embedding himself more deeply in the social fabric of Beaufort, Whitmore reduced the likelihood that uncomfortable questions about his plantation would gain traction. Power, when threatened, often responds not with overt repression, but with strategic generosity. The system rewards itself for silence. For the enslaved community, the legacy of Sarah's disappearance manifested in quieter, more personal ways. Stories circulated without names, warnings encoded in parables rather than facts. There was talk of a woman whose body had betrayed the rules, of a doctor who knew too much, of a child who never appeared. These stories were not told to provoke fear so much as to transmit knowledge indirectly. In environments where direct testimony could invite punishment, metaphor becomes a survival tool. The truth survived not as a coherent narrative, but as a pattern of avoidance and intuition. This mode of transmission ensured that the memory persisted without ever becoming explicit enough to be challenged openly. Over time, as new generations replaced old, the story's edges softened, but its core remained. There were limits to what could be spoken, and those limits were enforced not just by overseers, but by the structure of reality itself. Historians examining the region's records decades later encountered these silences as puzzles rather than indictments. Without explicit evidence, they framed anomalies as clerical errors, lost documents, or isolated irregularities. The methodological caution of historical scholarship, while understandable, inadvertently replicated the very logic that had suppressed the truth in the first place. By privileging what could be conclusively proven over what was systematically erased, historians risked mistaking absence for insignificance. Yet the persistence of these gaps, so consistent, so strategically placed, suggests intent rather than accident. The Whitmore plantation was not unique in this regard. Across the South, similar patterns emerge wherever enslaved bodies became sites of contradiction. What makes Sarah's case distinctive is not its isolation, but the clarity with which it reveals the mechanics of erasure. A pregnancy that should not have been possible forced the system to choose between explanation and suppression. It chose suppression, and in doing so refined its methods. The lesson was absorbed and replicated elsewhere. Anomalies are not to be investigated, but managed. Silence is not a failure of record-keeping, but a strategy. As the 1850s gave way to the upheavals of the following decade, the unresolved nature of Sarah's story remained buried beneath larger narratives of conflict and change. Yet even as national attention shifted toward war and emancipation, the underlying habits of concealment persisted. They would outlast the plantation itself, shaping how history was written and remembered long after the physical structures had decayed. Sarah's absence thus became more than a missing entry in a ledger. It became a template, a demonstration of how a system protects itself not by denying reality outright, but by making certain realities impossible to articulate. And in that impossibility, the mystery endured, not as a question waiting for an answer, but as a silence that demanded to be noticed. As the decades unfolded, and the era that had produced Sarah's impossible pregnancy receded further into the past, the silence surrounding it did not weaken, it matured. Silence, when maintained long enough, does not feel like absence anymore. It begins to feel like structure. By the time the Civil War loomed on the horizon, the Whitmore Plantation, like many others across the Lowcountry, had learned how to function with entire chapters of its own history deliberately excised. The system no longer needed to actively suppress what had happened. It had already trained everyone involved, enslaved laborers, overseers, physicians, neighbors, and record-keepers, on how to behave when confronted with something that did not fit the rules. You did not ask, you did not record, you did not remember out loud. This discipline of forgetting became second nature, passed down alongside practical knowledge of planting cycles and labor quotas. And in this way, Sarah's story transitioned from a concealed crisis into a foundational silence, one that shaped behavior long after the original actors were gone. When the war came and slavery began its slow, violent collapse, it might seem logical to expect that buried truths would finally surface, but upheaval does not automatically produce honesty. In many cases, it provides new cover. Records were destroyed in fires, courthouses were looted, plantations abandoned or repurposed, gaps in documentation multiplied, and genuine loss blended seamlessly with intentional erasure. In this chaos, Sarah's disappearance became even harder to isolate. Whatever fragments remained of Dr. Hadley's journals survived not because they were protected, but because they were overlooked, charred enough to seem insignificant, incomplete enough to avoid scrutiny. After emancipation, the focus of official history shifted toward rebuilding, reconciliation, and forward motion. There was little institutional appetite for investigating the intimate crimes of the past, especially those that implicated respected families and professionals who had seamlessly transitioned into the new social order. The Whitmore name persisted, stripped of its association with forced labor and quietly rebranded as part of local heritage. The plantation itself changed hands, its history flattened into architectural notes and land surveys. What had happened there was not denied, it was simply not included. For formerly enslaved communities, the silence took on a different shape. Freedom did not restore what had been erased. It did not return stolen children, repair violated bodies, or reconstruct family histories deliberately fragmented by sale, violence, and disappearance. Instead, people carried forward what knowledge they could, often in partial forms. Sarah's story survived not as a complete narrative, but as an unease that accompanied certain names, certain places, certain memories that elders avoided detailing. There were warnings disguised as advice, pauses where stories should have continued, glances exchanged when particular topics arose. Trauma does not require full recollection to endure. It embeds itself in behavior, in instinct, in the unspoken understanding that some truths are dangerous even after the laws that enforced silence have changed. In this way, the legacy of Sarah's pregnancy continued to shape lives without ever being fully articulated. Meanwhile, the medical profession moved forward with confidence. rarely looking back. Advances in anatomy and reproductive science would eventually make it clear that the surgical removal documented by Dr. Hadley should indeed have made pregnancy impossible. But by the time such knowledge became widespread, the case itself was too fragmented to examine directly. Hadley's name appeared in local histories as a competent physician, unremarkable, respectable. His later withdrawal from certain practices was attributed to age or temperament rather than trauma. The attempted destruction of his journals was never publicly questioned. In professional memory he remained intact. Medicine, like history, often preserves reputations by focusing on what can be proven rather than what is conspicuously absent. The contradiction at the heart of Sarah's case, so destabilizing in 1853, was now safely buried beneath layers of time, professional caution, and selective remembrance. Yet the mystery did not vanish entirely. It lingered at the margins, where historians and archivists occasionally encountered it without fully grasping its weight. A ledger with unexplained gaps, a medical invoice without outcome, a reference to a woman who appears once and never again. These anomalies were typically catalogued and moved past, treated as the inevitable imperfections of historical record-keeping. But imperfection has a pattern here. The omissions cluster around moments of violence, around bodies that resisted classification, around events that would have required acknowledgement of systemic abuse. Sarah's pregnancy sits squarely within that pattern. It is not an isolated curiosity, it is a fault line. And like all fault lines, it reveals stress points in the structure that tries to conceal it. What makes this stage of the story especially unsettling is how ordinary it is. There is no dramatic confrontation, no revelation that breaks the silence wide open. Instead, there is normalization. The extraordinary becomes unremarkable through sustained neglect. A pregnancy that once threatened to unravel certainty becomes, generations later, a footnote that few notice and fewer pursue. This is how power ultimately succeeds, not by disproving inconvenient truths, but by exhausting the will to seek them. The system that absorbed Sarah's impossible pregnancy did not need to justify itself. It simply waited. Time, indifference, and institutional habit did the rest. And yet, even in this long quiet, the story retains its pressure. It asks questions that cannot be fully answered, but also cannot be dismissed. How many other bodies carried contradictions that were erased rather than understood? How many records were adjusted, destroyed, or never created because acknowledging reality would have exposed violence too deeply embedded to confront? Sarah's case forces us to reckon with the possibility that what survives in archives is not a neutral reflection of the past, but a curated version shaped by fear and self-preservation. The mystery endures not because evidence is lacking, but because evidence was dangerous, and as long as that danger is not acknowledged, the silence surrounding it continues to shape how history is told. By this point, the story has moved beyond one woman, one doctor, one plantation. It has become an illustration of how systems respond when confronted with truths they cannot accommodate. They do not collapse. They adapt. They learn how to make impossibility disappear without explanation, and in doing so, they leave behind not answers but shadows. Shadows that still fall across the historical record, waiting for someone willing to stand in them long enough to feel what they conceal. By the time the 20th century arrived, the silence surrounding Sarah's impossible pregnancy had hardened into something resembling inevitability, as if the story itself had learned how to hide. The people who might have spoken with first-hand knowledge were gone, and those who inherited fragments of the truth had learned, often unconsciously, that survival sometimes meant restraint. In Beaufort, history was curated carefully, presented through preserved homes, guided tours, and polished narratives that emphasized elegance, resilience, and reconciliation while skirting the intimate brutalities that sustained wealth and tradition. The Whitmore Plantation, or what remained of it, became just another property layered with nostalgia, its rice fields reclaimed by marsh grass, its ledgers boxed and shelved, its human stories reduced to statistics. And yet, beneath this calm surface, the pressure of unresolved contradiction did not dissipate. It simply waited for the conditions that would allow it to surface again, not as a scandal, but as a question. That moment began quietly, not with a dramatic discovery, but with routine archival work. In the late 1970s, as interest in social history and marginalized narratives slowly gained institutional legitimacy, a graduate researcher examining medical practices in the antebellum South encountered references that did not align. Dr. Marcus Hadley's name appeared in shipping manifests, fee ledgers, and county death records, but there were gaps in his professional documentation that were statistically unusual for a physician of his stature. Most doctors of the period either left extensive journals or none at all. Hadley existed in between, enough records to establish credibility, too few to explain his later withdrawal from obstetrics. The charred fragments of his private journal, long misfiled among unrelated papers, were rediscovered not because someone was searching for them, but because someone finally had the patience to examine. At the intersection of medical violence, sexual exploitation, and institutional denial. To pursue it fully would require confronting how often enslaved women's bodies were treated as experimental sites, how frequently medical certainty was built on coerced suffering, and how willingly professionals collaborated with systems that rewarded their silence. These were not abstract questions. They implicated respected disciplines and local legacies that many institutions were still reluctant to interrogate. Outside academic circles, the story resurfaced differently. Oral histories collected from black families in the Low Country contained recurring motifs that, when viewed together, began to resemble echoes of Sarah's experience. Stories of women whose bodies were altered by doctors they could not refuse, of children born under circumstances no one would explain, of elders who warned younger generations about the dangers of visibility. These accounts were often dismissed as metaphorical or exaggerated, but when placed alongside archival evidence, they gained a different weight. They were not competing versions of history, they were parallel records, shaped by different rules of survival. Where official documents avoided meaning, oral tradition preserved it, even if it could not preserve detail. The re-emergence of Sarah's story in this fragmented form raises a deeper, more uncomfortable realization. The mystery persists not because it is unsolvable, but because solving it would force a reckoning with how knowledge itself was produced. Hadley's certainty that Sarah could not conceive was based on surgical intervention he himself performed under conditions that denied her autonomy. His horror at her pregnancy was not rooted in compassion for her, but in the collapse of a system of understanding that had justified his actions. The impossibility he documented was not biological alone, it was moral, and when that impossibility surfaced, the response was not investigation but erasure. This is where the story's gravity truly settles. Sarah's pregnancy challenges not just historical facts, but the logic that allowed those facts to be organized and controlled. It reveals how institutions respond when confronted with evidence that exposes their own violence. They do not always lie. Often, they simply stop speaking. They fragment records, redirect attention, and allow time to blur responsibility. And when enough time passes, the absence itself becomes normalized, accepted as the natural shape of the past. Yet normalization is not resolution. The continued resurfacing of Sarah's story, in archives, in whispered family histories, in the unease felt by those who encounter it, suggests that some truths resist containment. They persist because they are unresolved, because they point towards systems that have not fully accounted for themselves. The mystery of her pregnancy remains unsolved, not because it defies explanation, but because every plausible explanation implicates structures of power that benefited from silence. And as long as those structures remain insufficiently examined, the story will continue to haunt the margins of history, asking the same question it has always asked, not how this could happen, but why no one was willing to say what it meant. By now, the narrative has carried us far from the rice fields of the Whitmore plantation, but the distance is deceptive. The forces at work then, control over bodies, manipulation of knowledge, strategic forgetting, did not vanish with emancipation or modernization. They evolved. Sarah's story endures because it exposes a continuity that is uncomfortable to acknowledge. It reminds us that history is not just what happened, but what was allowed to be known, and at what cost. And as we move toward the final part of this story, The question is no longer whether Sarah's pregnancy was real. The evidence suggests that it was. The question now is whether we are prepared to confront what it reveals, about the systems that found it easier to erase a woman than to face the truth she embodied. As the story reaches its final turn, what remains most striking is not the unanswered question of how Sarah became pregnant, but the clarity with which her life exposes the machinery that made such a mystery possible in the first place. By now the evidence, fragmented though it is, has done its work. It has dismantled the illusion that this was a singular anomaly, a freak occurrence hovering at the edges of reason. Instead, it has revealed a system so practiced in controlling bodies and narratives that even contradiction itself could be absorbed, neutralized, and buried without formal denial. Sarah's pregnancy was not investigated because investigation would have required accountability. It would have required naming violence, coercion, and medical experimentation for what they were. It would have required admitting that the same institutions claiming rational authority were capable of acts so destructive that reality itself had to be edited to preserve their legitimacy. And so, the silence was not a failure of knowledge, it was a strategy. What makes this ending uncomfortable and necessary is the realization that closure was never the goal of those who erased Sarah. Closure is a modern desire, rooted in the belief that truth naturally resolves tension. But in the world Sarah inhabited, truth was dangerous. Truth disrupted property relations. Truth destabilized professional authority. Truth threatened the moral scaffolding that allowed ordinary men to participate in extraordinary cruelty while still seeing themselves as civilized. In that context, erasure, pregnancy disrupts the narrative of steady advancement by revealing the cost that was deliberately excluded from the story. And so, the final legacy of this story is not an answer, but a responsibility. A responsibility to read archives critically, to question what is missing as much as what is present. A responsibility to listen to voices that were never granted authority but nonetheless carried truth forward in other ways. A responsibility to recognize that silence in historical records is rarely neutral, it is often the residue of fear, guilt, or convenience. Sarah's life, reduced to fragments and contradictions, demands that we stop mistaking absence for insignificance. In the end, the strange pregnant slave mystery in Beaufort remains unexplained not because it defies logic, but because it exposes a logic that many would rather not examine. It tells us that history is not just a record of events, but a record of decisions, decisions about what to preserve, what to destroy, and whose humanity was considered expendable in the process. Sarah was denied authorship of her own story, but she was not denied impact. Her existence continues to unsettle the narratives built to contain her, reminding us that even the most carefully maintained silence can fracture over time. And if this story has held you until now, if it has made you uncomfortable, reflective, or curious about the parts of history that were never meant to be revisited, then I want you to pause for a moment. Stories like Sarah's survive only because people are willing to listen. So subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next buried chapter we uncover, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you. These histories were hidden for a reason, but together we can make sure they are never erased again.